Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. Who is here at the library for the first time tonight? Anyone? A single person? Really? Who is here for the 10th time or more? Who strongly suspects they have been coming here since before I was born? That's a pretty good number. For those who don't know me, my name is Emily Biggs. I'm the programs manager here at the American Library. And tonight, it is truly such a pleasure and such a delight to be welcoming the former director of the American Library in Paris, Charles Trueheart, as he presents his remarkable new book, Diplomats at War. For those who have not been at an event in the library for a while, the way this is going to work is Charlie will present the book, and after about 45 minutes, we are going to open it up to questions from you and the audience, and from our Zoom audience, who's inside that camera right there. Hello, Zoom. So if you're on Zoom, send those questions on the chat. If you're in person, just get ready to raise your hand, and we will be holding sales of Diplomats at War following the presentation, and Charlie will be signing some copies as well. So once you have learned all about it and you're dying to read it, it will be available thanks to our partner bookseller, Smith & Son, just outside. Now on to our speaker tonight. Charlie Trueheart, for most in the audience, needs absolutely no introduction, but he will get a brief one. Anyways, Charlie was the director of the American Library from 2007 to 2017, during which time he oversaw remarkable growth and evolution of the beloved institution that we are all sitting in right now, and he continues this service to the American Library as a member on the Board of Trustees as well. And I'd like to take this moment to thank all the other members of the Board of Trustees who are also in the audience tonight for their continuing support of the library. Now, before Charlie was at the library, his earlier career was in journalism, including 15 years at the Washington Post, first covering book publishing and literary topics, and then as a correspondent in Canada and France. Before joining the Post, Charlie was Associate Director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard University, Director of the Kennedy School of Government's Public Affairs Forum, and his writing has appeared at the Atlantic Monthly, the American Scholar, where he is a contributing editor. Now, Charlie's career at the American Library, under ordinary circumstances, would be incredibly hard to follow, but he's just about managed it with Diplomats at War, which is an absolute triumph. It has been celebrated by John Knight in the New York Times for its diligence to the task, its personal vantage. He celebrates Charlie for admirably culling from memoirs, dossiers, and telegrams. Publishers Weekly celebrated this as an important and unique contribution to the early history of the American War in Vietnam. And Charlie was, as well as someone who really elevated the work that we do in cultural programming at the American Library. He made Evenings with an Author what it is today. So it feels so special and so meaningful to be able to close that circle today and to welcome him back as the author with whom we are going to spend the evening to be presenting this book. So please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to him. Charlie, thank you so much.
Emily, thank you so much, and thank you to Alfonso and Emma for putting on this program tonight, and of course to Audrey Chapuis and the whole library team for the amazing work that they're doing and continue to do, which I have the privilege of observing as a trustee now. It is obviously very unusual, very an odd feeling to be standing here as the author when I've stood at this podium literally hundreds of times introducing other authors, and then usually scooting out and going home. So tonight I have to stay for the full hour. I will try to really work to get this done in about half an hour so that there's plenty of time for questions. I would just begin by saying that both the title and subtitle of my new book each have double meanings, and the book explores those two meanings. That is, Diplomats at War is about two American diplomats who were serving in Vietnam in wartime, and it's about two American diplomats who had a terrible falling out after a long friendship. And so they were, in a sense, at war with each other by the end of the events that I cover in the book. And the subtitle, likewise, you may not be able to make it out clearly, Friendship and Betrayal, is the story of the United States and Vietnam, allies that the United States, in some lights, betrayed, an ally they betrayed by overthrowing the government, which is the climax of the story I tell. And it's also about the friendship between these two diplomats who were named Fritz Nolting and Bill Trueheart. They were classmates, graduate students at the University of Virginia in 1939 when they first met, and worked together in Paris in the 1950s, where Fritz Nolting became my godfather, and then were sent as the number one and the number two Americans at the embassy in Saigon in 1961. So the story is about geopolitics and about a personal relationship. There's a third duality that I can talk more about, perhaps in questions, which is that sometimes you'll see this book, including in library publicity, as a memoir, and it is a memoir. As I put it in the book, it's a work of memory hiding inside a work of history. It is the vast majority of the book came from my own researches, from the archives, from reading books, and from some family correspondence. What I remember as a 10, 11, and 12-year-old in this period is not much, but whatever I've put in the book that I remember, I honestly did. And I was helped to recover my memories by talking to a lot of my former pre-adolescent classmates, tracking them down in the present time. So this is also my first PowerPoint presentation, so. So let's begin with a little bit of what already I'm not doing it right. Okay. Thank you, Alfonso. Just a little quick background. In 1961, Vietnam, when I first arrived and when the main characters in my book first arrived, Vietnam had been, South Vietnam had been an independent country since 1956, and at the end of, in the early 1950s, the French, who had ruled Vietnam for almost 80 years, were thrown out and left Vietnam, and essentially left Vietnam to the Americans, although it took a few years to come out that way. And the country was divided temporarily at the 17th parallel, what we later came to know as the DMZ. This was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, but by 1961 it had become pretty permanent. And of course by 1975 it had truly been a temporary 20-year hiatus when the forces of the North beat the South Vietnamese and took Saigon. So as the story in this book opens, there are two nationalists in Vietnam. The one everyone remembers today is on your left, Ho Chi Minh. His name is on the city of Saigon, where the action of this book takes place. Today it's called Ho Chi Minh City, and he's really doesn't figure in the book at all. But I just wanted to remind you that it's the loser of this battle, the man on the right, who's at the center of this story. That's Ngo Dinh Diem. He had been selected with a lot of help from the United States as the president of South Vietnam, although he had some management experience but very little political experience. And by 1961, the ruling family was, the ruling family of Vietnam had taken power and was installed mainly Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, and brother and counselor, and Ngo Dinh Nhu's wife, Madame Nhu, who is often well remembered. So Ngo Dinh Diem and his ally John F. Kennedy were, when John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, Vietnam was not really on the screen. The subject matter that he had to deal with was Cuba, Berlin, and Laos. These may not be in the right order. Here's John F. Kennedy in 1961 discussing what's going on in Laos, and Vietnam not yet on his horizon, although quickly becoming so. I started to say the ruling family. Here's Ngo Dinh Diem on the postage stamp. He was on actually all the postage stamps, and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu and Madame Nhu. Madame Nhu was the first lady of South Vietnam because Ngo Dinh Diem was a bachelor president, and she served in that role and had a lot of power. So in 1961, one of the first steps that President Kennedy took was to name Frederick Nolting as ambassador to South Vietnam. Nolting had very little experience in Asia. He had been the #2 American official at the U.S. delegation to NATO in Paris at the time, and his deputy in Paris was my father, Bill Trueheart. Here they are in their first days in Vietnam, Fritz Nolting, and on your right, Biddy Nolting, my godmother, and on Fritz's other side is Ngo Dinh Nhu, who I mentioned before, going to visit some military operation or development operation. A few months later, he chose Bill Trueheart to be his deputy chief of mission, and we arrived about 6 months after the Noltings did. So the two families that had been together in Paris during the 1950s were reunited in Saigon. Here they are as undergraduates at the University of Virginia, Bill Trueheart on the left and Fritz Nolting on the right. And at Christmas time, 1961, the Noltings and the Truehearts gathered for a drink in the garden of the ambassador's residence, and my father and I are not in the picture because I took the picture and my father was leaning over me apparently and telling me how to do it. Just a few family pictures just so you can get some of the feel for this. My father in our garden and my mother and father at a reception there. On the left is a Christmas card that we sent while we were in Saigon, and probably most of my colleagues here at the library didn't know that I have a yellow belt in judo, but I didn't go any further than that. So the Nolting and Trueheart and basically everyone at the embassy and everyone in the administration were behind the government of South Vietnam. And the #1 issue for the United States was the Viet Cong insurgency that had taken fire in about 1959 and was getting worse and worse. And it was becoming, the fragility of the Diem regime was becoming very apparent. But basically the US and everyone at the embassy in Saigon was on board with this strange ruling family in Vietnam, democratically elected, but when you get 90% of the vote, you have some idea of how reliable the voting statistics are. My father often had to serve as chargé d'affaires at the embassy when Fritz Nolting had to go to Washington or to endless conferences in Hawaii to figure out what to do in Vietnam. These are still the early years. To give you some idea, when we got to Saigon in 1961, there were fewer than 1,000 American military personnel in Vietnam. And when we left 2 years later, at the end of the Kennedy administration, there were 3,000, and you'll probably, I'm sorry, there were 15,000, and you'll probably remember that by the time American military presence reached its peak, there were 540,000 American soldiers. So these are very early days, and many of the things that some of us remember about the Vietnam War hadn't yet happened or hadn't come into, hadn't crystallized. For example, the notion of hawks and doves was something that hadn't really emerged in the United States. Everyone was a hawk, even the American reporters who were posing difficult questions and doing very accurate reporting, all believed in the mission of fighting the Viet Cong and in the inevitability of the Ngo family running Vietnam. That began to change in 1962. One piece of evidence of that was that John F. Kennedy sent his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to Saigon for a very brief visit. And I like this picture because I call it the little brother's picture, because on the left is President Diem's little brother, in the middle is John F. Kennedy's little brother, and on the right is Fritz Nolting's younger friend, not his brother, but they were all there as stand-ins for the principals. During 1962, skepticism began to be voiced, and criticism of the U.S. arrangement with the South Vietnamese government began to be heard from such people as notably John Kenneth Galbraith, who was the U.S. ambassador to India and had the president's ear. There were also two officials in the State Department, the officials who, and the White House, for whom Bill and Fritz worked, who were beginning to lose patience with the government and with the approach that the U.S. was taking. Here's a family picture of Fritz Nolting and two of the people who would lead the cabal to overthrow the government of Vietnam at the time. That's Roger Hilsman lighting a cigarette on the left, and Michael Forrestal on the right, who was a 33-year-old White House aide who had the president's ear and was also very close to my father. There's some Exeter graduates in the room tonight, and Mike Forrestal went to Exeter, just to point that out. Most importantly, I think, for the way that Vietnam was being viewed in the United States was the reporting that was coming out of American correspondents in Saigon. All three of these guys were in their 20s and became very famous in later years. That's David Halberstam on the left, Malcolm Brown in the middle, and Neil Sheehan on the right. And Sheehan and Halberstam went on to write very important books about Vietnam that probably most of you have read who care about this subject. So the reporting was getting more critical, and it appears that from my research that even though Fritz and Bill, Fritz thought they saw eye to eye, but it's pretty clear my father was beginning to shift and begin to line up with the skeptics about this government, not about the righteousness of the cause. In 1963, so 2 years after Nolting had arrived, was the year when some very dramatic things happened. The first one was in the first days of January. There was a battle called Ap Bac, in which the South Vietnamese forces put up a catastrophic performance and were wiped out by Viet Cong, 5 helicopters were destroyed. I think more than 100 soldiers died in that battle, and one of the American leaders, officers present at that battle, John Paul Vann, who Sheehan later wrote an entire book about, or built a book about Vietnam around him, said some things off the record, but that were published in the New York Times that were highly critical, and the edifice began to crumble a little bit. But it was the South Vietnamese government that ultimately did itself in my opinion. In May of 1963, in the city of Hue, there was a Buddha's birthday peaceful march that somehow provoked the forces of order, and there was a melee, and 8 people died. Some of them crushed under the wheels of an armored personnel character, and this caused obviously a big sensation in Washington. What's going on out there? And it fell to Nolting initially to try to persuade the President Diem to make reparations for this incident, and to apologize, and to recognize Buddhism as more than an association, that is, for the religion it is. And it's worth noting here that the ruling family were Roman Catholics, as were most of the ruling class, French-speaking ruling class in South Vietnam, were either Catholics by profession or Catholics by convenience. There's some of them called 1955 Catholics because they became Catholic when Diem took power, and it was a way up in his hierarchy. So a few weeks after this incident in Hue that began to make headlines around the world, Fritz Nolting and his family left Saigon on a very badly timed vacation, and they were gone from Saigon for 6 weeks. And during that period, my father was in charge, and it fell to my father to deliver these messages to President Diem from the White House and from the State Department. Apparently, and in the view of many, my father felt much more comfortable delivering much tougher messages and warnings to the Vietnamese president, and it angered Diem. It angered Diem that Nolting was not there. Nolting, he found a much more pleasant, genial character than he did Bill Trueheart, and he was undoubtedly insulted by the fact that it was a mere number 2 at the embassy who was delivering these warnings. So that's where things stood. Nolting's gone on vacation. Trueheart and the other people in the embassy are trying to get through to the Vietnamese government that things are really getting bad. But they didn't know how bad they were going to get, because the next thing that happened was the famous self-immolation of a Buddhist monk on the streets of Saigon, just a few blocks from where I lived. This photograph was taken by Malcolm Brown, perhaps the least known of those 3 reporters that you saw in that earlier picture. But he was the only one who bothered to get out of bed and follow a tip that this was going to happen, because apparently there were a lot of false alarms. And he had a camera, and this picture appeared on the front page of many newspapers around the world, and shocked President Kennedy, of course, a Roman Catholic himself, who was now allied to another Roman Catholic, who was beset by forces that, frankly, most Americans had not even thought about. The Buddhists were not a political force until overnight. They became a political force, and anybody who had beefs with the government in Vietnam found a cause to get behind religious discrimination and this protest movement that took such a dramatic form. Just to give you some idea, this is a map that's in my book. You'll see, if you can read it, I barely can, but if you see on the top left, towards the top left, you'll see DCM residence. That's where I lived. Nearby is the U.S. ambassador's residence, and the self-immolation was 3 blocks away. It was a very small town, and it's of interest to many people that in this time of war and of Viet Cong attacks, some of them in the city, the American kids like me, there were 800 of us, K through 12 in the American school there, all had free reign in Saigon. We roamed the streets, rode our bikes, took the pus anywhere we wanted to go, to the swim club, and it is, now that I've gone through parenthood myself, it is pretty amazing that my parents were so relaxed about raising their 11-year-old kid in an environment like that and letting him do as he pleased. So during the month of June 1963, while Nolting is away, my father is obviously under instruction from Washington to put a lot of pressure on Diem to mend his ways, and if at all possible, to send Ngo Dinh Nhu, his brother, and his sister-in-law out of the country, because they were behind, the U.S. thought they were the ones who were calling the shots behind the scenes, and they were the hardliners. And that's probably true. Madame Nhu made things a good deal worse almost immediately after the self-immolation by giving an interview. She was very quotable and very off the reservation, we would say, and described the self-immolation as a barbecue and mocked the Buddhists for having to use imported gasoline to carry out this protest, and many other wild and outrageous things. Of course, it perhaps goes without saying that the Diem family, the Ngo family, believed that the Buddhists were being put up to what they were doing by the communists. There's really not much evidence of that, except, of course, once the ruling family showed weakness, and when it was clear they were in perilous straits with their own supporters in Washington, that the Viet Cong took advantage of that, needless to say. So during that very difficult period, my father saw Diem almost every day. Here he is. I'm going to show you the good cop, bad cop. Here he is, trying to be friendly, and they're having a good laugh about something on one of those meetings. And then here he is, a little more leaning forward and putting it a little more sternly. Perhaps one can only imagine what's going on in these pictures. But in the latter part of the month of June, President Kennedy decided to replace Nolting with Henry Cabot Lodge. And Nolting learned that he'd been dismissed through commercial radio on the USS Constitution. He was crossing the Atlantic to go home on home leave. This shocked the family and humiliated Nolting, and he was particularly angry at, obviously, at his bosses in Washington, those guys you saw poolside earlier, Averell Harriman, who was ranking person in the State Department who was in charge of Vietnam, and whose name is familiar to many of you, perhaps because his widow was ambassador to France many years later. So Nolting was sacked. He had actually been asking since the end of the previous year to be relieved of his duties, and he kept being told, no, you're doing a great job, just keep at it, and then was blindsided by his dismissal. And in addition to blaming his superiors in Washington, he blamed my father for not keeping him in touch with what was going on in Vietnam. And that's a fact. He didn't keep him in touch. And one of the questions that the book raises and doesn't quite answer is, why not? Perhaps Trueheart was told to not bring Nolting into the picture because they thought Nolting was looked too kindly and had too much at stake in the survival of the Diem regime. But in any case, they didn't communicate during this entire 6-week period. Nolting came back for a few weeks to pack his bags and to try to pull something out of the fire with the regime, but it didn't work. But apparently he and my father had stormy conversations. We don't really know the contents of them. We do know that in fact, here's a picture from the local English language newspaper of Nolting arriving back in Saigon after being fired, and they look like they're, good old friends, but a terrible breach had happened between them. And really, to finish with the Bill and Fritz part of this, and to go back to the notion of betrayal, Fritz felt that he'd been betrayed by many people, including his former best friend. And my father's sense of betrayal came from the fact that within days after leaving Vietnam in early August of '63, Nolting wrote what used to be called an efficiency report, which we would call today a performance review, in which he questioned, among other things, questioned my father's loyalty. And in 1963, the days of the loyalty oaths of the 1950s, the whole notion of loyalty to your country during the period of the Red Scare, that was a very hot word. And my guess is that, it's not just a guess, the two men never spoke to each other again, and the families likewise. There were a few meetings between the wives and one of the daughters and me, but basically after 1964, the two families were estranged. So in August, two things happened around the 21st of August, 1963. Yes, here. This is the final dinner at the presidential palace before Nolting left. A very sad occasion, although everyone seems to be smiling. That's Fritz in white on the left, and my father 2 seats down. And Diem is at the head of the table, but unfortunately not in the picture. So on the 21st of August, two things happened. One is that the forces of No Din New, basically the secret police, the enforcers of the regime, raided the Buddhist pagodas in Saigon and other Vietnamese cities, and there was some loss of life and a great deal of outrage around the world that, given all that had happened, that they hadn't learned their lesson and they wanted to punish the Buddhists for the threat to their own power. And a day after those raids, so it was no coincidence that they happened then, the day after Henry Cabot Lodge arrived in Saigon, city under martial law that night, or those nights. And Henry Cabot Lodge, as some of you will remember, was the vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party in 1960. And it is said that Kennedy chose him to be ambassador. He was a very skilled public servant and had been ambassador to the United Nations in the 50s. He'd also been a senator from Massachusetts until he was beaten by John F. Kennedy in 1962. But Kennedy chose him thinking that that would buy him some insulation during the upcoming presidential election of 1964 if there were Republican fingerprints on whatever was going on in Vietnam. It was also pretty clear that Lodge knew that he was coming to Saigon and that there would be a coup d'etat. He and Kennedy discussed it in veiled terms in their farewell interview at the White House. This is a point in the story where I was able to actually listen to the first recordings from the White House. And so you can hear Kennedy and Lodge, who've obviously known each other for many years, speaking in euphemisms about the job that needed to be done. And almost as soon as Lodge got to Vietnam, through a series of complicated, fascinating events you can read about in my book, Lodge got the message that to give the green light to the Vietnamese generals who had been talking about a coup d'etat and wanting to do it, but not getting themselves together to do it. But they got the green light in August, and for the next 2 months was a kind of waiting game while the generals kept testing the U.S.'s willingness to get behind them were they successful in overthrowing the regime, and Kennedy agonizing in Washington about what instructions to give at all, because he knew very well that he didn't want his fingerprints on an unsuccessful coup d'etat. And had been from the first months of his administration soiled by the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion and by being dressed down by Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna over the Berlin crisis. And he didn't need another foreign policy debacle. And he was worried that's what would happen. So here's Henry Cabot Lodge, another tall American, presenting his credentials to Notre Dame. And here's Lodge and my father working on perhaps a speech or a telegram in his office, and then my parents with Lodge at his house. He was a very glamorous character, and clearly my father felt tremendous admiration for his savoir-faire and his ability to deal with the news media, and for his power, no doubt. So 2 months pass with a lot of dithering by the generals and lots of other smaller dramas going on, until finally the coup happened on November 1st, 1963. This was by far the most noise and fighting that I'd ever experienced. A night of listening to rockets overhead, and I had the great fortune of being at a friend's house right after school, and my father on that Friday, and my father called my friend's mother and said, will you keep Charlie there, because the coup is happening, is underway. So that left my mother and a 2-year-old alone at home while he was at the embassy and I was at my friend's house. And we had a wonderful, exciting night. And that friend is Alan Perry, who is here tonight, who one of the many people I was able to reconnect with in the course of writing this book. But it was quite an evening. You can ask him all about it. see if our stories line up with each other. So here's a couple of scenes from the coup. We were able to go out, Ella and I and our other pals, the day after the 2nd of November to see the damage because the coup was over. It had been a successful, very brief coup. And I remember picking up spent shell casings and berets and things like that left behind from the fighting. It was and here's looting, unclear exactly what this site was, but there was a lot of looting, needless to say. But it was what you might call a bloodless coup. There was very little blood that was shed. Surprisingly, there was a lot of worry that there was going to be open warfare for weeks, and the U.S. had positioned aircraft off the coast of Vietnam to airlift dependents out of Saigon should they need to be. But it was over very quickly. But among the blood that was shed included the blood of Ngo Dinh Diem, the president, and his brother, who offered to surrender to the generals and be escorted out of Vietnam. And somewhere after they surrendered and their next stop, they were murdered, macheted in the back of a U.S. armored personnel carrier. This is all carrier. This is all by Vietnamese soldiers, but I just mentioned where some of their equipment was coming from. And this was also very shocking to Kennedy. You can get some idea of how close things were. The U.S. Embassy was here. Diem was assassinated here. This is, as you can see, just 10, 12 blocks away from anything that was going on there. So the coup happened, and it was the first of 5 or 6 coups in South Vietnam in the following 2 years, because one set of generals were taking hints from the Americans that it wasn't working out, so there would be not a violent coup, but just say many changes of government. Three weeks after the coup d'etat in Saigon, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and this last picture is my father was once again chargé d'affaires because Lodge was back in Washington plotting what to do with the new government in Vietnam. And here he is, here's Bill receiving a delegation of people who wanted to come and pay their condolences to the United States after Kennedy was killed. Our family left Saigon 2 months later. Nolting had gone back to the State Department, and by February of '64 resigned from the Foreign Service because he'd been given a non-job. And my father continued to be a Foreign Service officer and to work in the State Department, initially on Southeast Asian affairs, without Vietnam in the picture. So the 4 countries he knew nothing about were the ones he was in charge of: Laos, Cambodia, Burma, and Thailand. And then left the Vietnam dossier and did become an ambassador in the late 1960s to Nigeria, but also retired from the Foreign Service while he was still in his 50s. I've taken you through the sequence of events that I try to cover with many more words in the book, but it's always the best part. I would love to hear what questions you may have, including about how I did the research, and also about what happened or something I may have skipped over. How are we doing? 8:15. Excuse me for going on so long. So may I take questions?
Can we have a huge round of applause first, please?
Hi, Charlie.
Hi.
Can't wait to read it. You mentioned that this is as much memoir as history. It's a memoir wrapped in history. As you were talking, especially about your family's experience, I was wondering how much you were able to talk to your parents about their time there. And I'm particularly interested in whether you were able to speak to your mother about her experience of being a close spectator to all of these events, as so many Foreign Service spouses are.
Well, during the course of writing this book, the answer is no. My father died in 1992, and he never discussed this dramatic thing that happened to him at all with me. It was kind of a non-subject in our house. My father referred to it as the business with Fritz. And when asked by, not by me, but when asked by my brother, who was a teenager in the 70s, he said it's all in the Halberstam book. And those of you who have read The Best and the Brightest, there's a section in there that talks about Nolting and Trueheart, and that's how I first learned about it. My mother told me, was really the one who was telling me things as they were happening in real time, somewhat after the break between my father and godfather. She told me what had happened, and was always willing to talk about it, but frankly it was a non-subject in our house. So anybody who thinks that my book is somehow channeling what Bill thought, or that I'm taking up his cause in this book, I think if you read it you'll see that that's not really the case. I think they both were up to their necks in something much bigger than they were, and it was a very stressful time and a very sad time for the family. But I have been asked, what might you have asked your father, or what might he have said to you? First of all, he wouldn't have liked the fact that I was writing about it, that's for sure. And I doubt I would have even begun to take on this project if he had been alive. And of course, Nolting died in 1989. So, in a way, it was freeing to not have those people around. I felt I could kind of look into it on my own, and the archives of the State Department are a real wonder, a book writer's treasure trove, really, beautifully preserved. All the telegrams back and forth to Saigon with information about who drafted the telegram and who approved it and what time of night it was received and all that stuff, all in these beautiful books, 4 volumes of these telegrams, which were a major source material for me. And the other major source was oral histories that my father and Nolting and everybody else you can imagine at the White House or the State Department or at the embassy later gave long oral histories, which is how I learned most of what I know about my father's own life.
Charlie, later in your father's career or his life, did he publicly express his opinion about the war retrospectively?
Well, he was still a civil servant while the Vietnam War was going on. He was also somebody who didn't like to speak in public and didn't consider himself a prophet without honor, the way I think Nolting did. I think it was pretty clear that he didn't approve of the course that the war had taken. And my mother thought that one of the reasons he was so against U.S. involvement in Vietnam was that he was very worried that I might end up there and that he would have perhaps my blood on his hands. But he didn't talk much about it, but I knew from inference, really, that he strongly disapproved of this war and thought we should get out as honorably as we could, as soon as we could. And in fact, surprised me one day by telling me that he was in 1968 when Nixon was running against Hubert Humphrey. He told me, I don't know what he actually did, but he told me that he might consider voting for Nixon because he thought the Johnson administration was too deeply involved and that we needed a clean sweep and to start over, even if it was Nixon. So, is that some kind of answer, Ken?
Yes, sir. Hi, Charlie. I just wondered, I wondered whether you talked to any members of the Nolting family about the personal meaning for them of the breakup with your family and the political repercussions.
Well, not for 30 or 40 years, but when I was doing the book, yes. Nolting's widow is still alive. She's 103. And she lives in Charlottesville, not far from where I spend most of my time now. And I was able to interview her in 2017, 2018, when she still had some memories of this, and attempted to smooth it over and said, what? Well, there was no rupture. And I said, come on, And she said, well, maybe, and didn't seem to hurt your father too much. And I thought, well, okay, so she was still feeling it too. The real help was from the Noltings had 4 daughters. One died tragically many years ago, but the one who was the kind of designated family historian, Lindsay Nolting, who lives in Virginia also, I think was the person designated or self-designated to deal with me. And she was incredibly helpful, knowing that this was not going to be something that anybody in their family wanted to revisit. She was a real brick and really helpful, and I'm happy to say we're friends now. And she's just a few weeks ago, I gave a talk at the University of Virginia, where her father had, after his retirement, had wound up teaching and helping to run a place called the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. Nolting, in fact, had been its first director. That's where I spoke, and Lindsay came and was recognized there, and I just think she's being a real grown-up about it. And I also think, I'll just say it, I think the book is very fair. I think it, I have a lot of affection and admiration for Fritz Nolting, and I think it comes through. Edith? Oh, sorry. Let's do this in order, yeah?
I'm going to ask a question that might be a little too personal for a public forum like this, but I ask this as a retired Foreign Service officer myself and aware of the fact that Foreign Service service, or the service of the Foreign Service, is often a very family business. It gets passed along from son to daughter, to son, or to his son to daughter, etc.
Mm-hmm.
You chose a different profession, and I'm wondering why. And did the experience, what you saw, the interpersonal relationships you saw between your father and his boss in Saigon, or anything else, affect you as far as your decision not to pursue diplomacy yourself?
Well, there's several answers to that. First of all, my father thought it was the worst thing I could do would be to join the Foreign Service. And I don't think it came just out of, I know it didn't come just out of the experience he had in Vietnam. I think he was feeling way back in the 60s and 70s that technology and the ease of world travel and television were tightening the freedom that diplomats on the scene had. Many of these telegrams that I read, giving instructions to Nolting or Trueheart, said, we think this is the way you ought to go, but you're the person on the spot and you should do it the way you call it because you're the expert. And I think my father was beginning to see that wasn't going to be the case for much longer. So that was one reason. When I talked to David Halberstam as an adult, he said that really what a young person ought to be doing, this was the 1970s, was not joining the Foreign Service, but joining the CIA, because that's where the action really was. And you really were much more in the thick of things and much more stimulating career. Despite what my father thought, I took the Foreign Service exam and failed it. Failed the written test, which is the first part, after which you go through a very taxing oral interviews and so forth. So that option was taken off the table, and I guess I was relieved, and eventually wound up being a foreign correspondent, so I got to have some of the experience of reporting back from a foreign country to Washington. So I think I probably lucked out in all respects, and I had, when I met my wife, who's here tonight, of course, one thing we had in common, besides the French language, was that we'd both failed the Foreign Service exam. So it's a wonder the Foreign Service has survived without us. But
yeah, you talked a little bit about your sources, and what triggered my interest really was this recording you mentioned. That's one example. Oral history, the amazing access you had, or the interesting access to the State Department. What else? Can you tell us more about the array of sources you use, please?
Well, the oral histories and the State Department archives were the main ones. We had, not on policy, but my father, from the day he left home in 1935 until his mother died in the mid-1970s, wrote her 2 or 3 times a week. And she saved every letter in order in their envelopes in a department store box. And it was, in some sense, a gold mine for this project, because I could track what was going on with the family, especially what was going on with my brother and me. But of course, for security reasons, he never said a word in any of these letters about what was really going on. So it was very frustrating, but at least I had the kind of structure of what was going on in our family life, and it helped to trigger memories for me of being there, or, that was the same time that this happened. And my mother, though she didn't write her mother-in-law that often, did write her commendably often, and also wrote her friends who saved their letters. And so much more candid, colorful, lively letters that she wrote were also very helpful to me. I did do some interviews. There are very few adults, people who were adults in Saigon at the time, still alive today when I started working on the book. So I had 3 people, basically only 3 of those people. Some of you may recognize the name Anthony Lake, who was in his first Foreign Service posting, 23 years old, walked into this whole scene, and I was able to talk to him. He's still alive and kicking in Washington, and went on to a very distinguished career in diplomacy. So those were the main things. So I did use, well, obviously there's probably 100 books about this whole thing, and I, of course, stole liberally from all of them.
Can we have a final round of applause, please?
Thank you all so much for coming.